Welcome back. Now, in our first lecture, we asked that important question of what is international law? What is international law and how do we approach it? And I said there is a traditional definition of international law, which is to say international law is the law between the states. And when I use the word state, of course, I don't mean it in terms of the United States. I think of it in terms of a country, a nation. In fact, there's a number of synonyms for the word state. We could refer to a state, we could refer to a nation, we could refer to a country or a people or a sovereign. Statehood is a concept that actually arose out of medieval Europe in what was called the Peace of Westphalia, a treaty that was settled in 1648. And I've got another presentation on that. You should look at that as well. We know that we gain the idea of states as sovereign entities that are co-equal. No matter how big or how small the unit is, they are co-equal sovereigns. And we'll be talking more about sovereignty in the future, but for right now, think of sovereignty as meaning the ability to control all the matters within your borders, the ability to exercise ultimate control over the matters that are in our borders. Now, in the last few decades, we have seen the state, the role of the state, decline in world affairs. We've seen what we call non-state actors take on an increasingly important role. Now, sometimes those non-state actors are formal creations, something like the United Nations, which resembles a state in some respect, but in fact is not a state. We have seen it in things like the European Union, a group of states that acts a bit like a state, definitely has state-like elements, but is not a state. It's a non-state actor. We have dozens and dozens of non-governmental units, non-governmental organizations also taking on a role in international affairs. And then what we see most primarily in recent years has been the growth of these terrorist units like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, those entities that are not states, that, and in fact in Al-Qaeda definitely has no ambitions to be a state, but which have played the role that was traditionally played by a state. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the elements of statehood. What are the things that make a state? We'll talk about why is being a state important. So we start with this first question of what is needed to be considered a state. Well, in the law, whenever we're defining something, we will break it down into its component elements. And that's what we're going to do here. And we know that there are actually 4 elements that are required in order for an entity to be considered a state. Now, these 4 elements were officially described in a treaty back in the early 1900s, which we'll talk about later when we get to treaties. But these 4 elements are traditionally the elements that are necessary in order to constitute a state. We know, first of all, that a state has to have a population. Now, this element is actually probably the least important element of statehood because, in fact, there are no limits to how small a state could be. A state could be 350,000 people, which is the size of Iceland. It could be 2 billion people, the size of China. In fact, a state could be even somewhere 5, 10, 12. We don't know what the lower limit is. We just know that a state has to have a population in order to be considered a state. This population requirement is met even if you have a population of people that are nomadic or transitory, that spend part of their time in the state and part of their time outside of the state. As long as they are inside the state, then the state will exist as a state because it has a population. Now, the next thing we know about a state is the state must have a defined territory. There must be some physical representation of statehood. There must be borders to some effect. So a state has to have a territory. Now again, it could be very small. It could be something the size of Vatican City, which is a few square miles. It could be something incredibly large on the order of thousands of square miles, like in Canada. But a state has to have a territory in order to be considered a state. Now the third element is a state has to have a government. And when we talk about a government in this sense, we mean a government that is capable of governing the internal affairs of the state. So a state has to have some authority that is able to exercise authority over the affairs of the state. Now sometimes this can be complicated because you may have two competing interests, each claiming to be the government of a state. And in that case, in terms of determining who's the government of the state, we actually have to return to that fourth element, is that a state has to be capable of entering into foreign relations. Now this is probably the most important element of statehood because this element relates to recognition by the world community. In order to be considered a state, you must be recognized as a state by the world community. Now, again, we don't know how many states have to recognize you as a state in order to be considered a state. And in fact, there are numerous areas around the world which have been recognized as states by some countries, but not recognized by states by other countries. So take, for example, Kosovo. And again, I've got another presentation on Kosovo. But Kosovo may or may not be a state, depending on the government's perspective. So it has this sort of in-between status. This fourth element, this idea of recognition, is the most important element of statehood. So recognition of a statehood is vital. It's the first step in order to gain statehood status. You must show that you are a state. Now, other states have no duty to recognize the new state. There's no obligation to recognize a new state. And in fact, as I said, states have the ability to recognize different groups attempting to seize power. Sometimes we will recognize a state as the government of a state, even though they're not actually controlling the country at the present time. In a number of areas in the world, for instance, Libya, we may have several groups, each exercising control over different areas of the country, but the United States has chosen one of those groups as this group that it will recognize as the legitimate government of Libya. So states have the ability to recognize different governments depending on a number of factors. Now, a state's status can change. The status of an international state can change, sometimes due to circumstances. For instance, we have a concept called succession, which occurs when a state takes over another state's territory. And of course, right now, this question of has succession occurred obviously would be the Crimean Peninsula, which belonged to Ukraine, but which then seceded and was then annexed by Russia. So has succession occurred or not? Many of the Western governments would argue that no succession has occurred because the annexation was illegal. Now sometimes the succession can occur formally through the means of a treaty. States can take on new areas based on a treaty with another state. But succession is that process whereby one state takes over another state's territory. Secession is the breakup of a state. And again, we can look to Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula and their attempt to secede from Ukraine. So one could argue that secession has taken place there. Secession also plays a role in the matter of Kosovo and the statehood of Kosovo, because Kosovo was a province of Serbia, and they have attempted to secede from Serbia and become another new state called Kosovo.